All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday. It is August 1st of 2022. Thank you for tuning in here today. It is August already. Football here coming up very, very quickly, it feels like, on us here. I was knocking out some basketball drafts over the weekend here. Always something that kind of gets me in the mood for some football. It starts to feel like it's that time of the year. I was getting things ready on the home league that I commission. What's the verb form of commissioner? I guess commission that I run over the weekend. So really starting to feel like that time of the year. For those that are tuning in, listening for the first time, welcome. My name is Jordan. I am the head coach here at SaberSim. And on this show, I answer questions that we get from the SaberSim community about how to use SaberSim to build better DFS lineups. So if you would like to ask any questions and you're joining me live, you can ask them in the office now that I've said it, I might as well finish it. You can ask any questions in the Office Hours channel in our Slack community. If you're not already in Slack, there's a link to join in the description of every past show. If you are joining me live here, you can ask your questions live in the YouTube chat. And you can also always email your questions in, support@sabersim.com. We have a lot of questions to get through today. We've had a busy weekend here. I was scrolling back through on Slack here this morning, just getting caught up. We have a lot to get into. I know there were a handful of questions that came in via support over the weekend as well. So a lot to talk about here. We will get into it all shortly here. But if you have questions for me, go ahead and fire away at me now, especially today. Get your questions in the queue, get them answered a little bit earlier. Brad's here. Welcome back, Brad. I know it has been a while since I have seen your name pop up, but glad to see you again here. Looks like our viewer count is ticking up as well. So welcome, everybody. Happy Monday. Let's go ahead and start diving in here. What we are going to do, we're going to start here. We're going to try to kill two birds with one stone a little bit here. There were at least a couple questions about research builds. It looks like Mitchell here needed it asked for some help about 0010 research builds. And then we had a question come in through support as well. An interesting one about navigating a situation where your research build and then your actual default build, your actual working build that you're going to use to enter your lineups disagree, and what to do there or how to think about that. So let's talk, I guess, kind of first here. We'll call this research builds. And I'll pull this up on the screen so people joining here now know what we're talking about. I'm sure it comes to no surprise to people that watch this show regularly. We are once again talking about these research builds. I'm going to do my best I can to avoid rambling too much on this subject because I will do that, and we'll move along here. So first of all, so what is the research build, right? What are we doing here, right? What's the point of this? So first of all, this is a build that I run. It's called a research build for a reason. It's mostly a way for me to learn about what the slate looks like, how my strategy might look like for the slate. And what we do is we run a build here on 0010 sliders, and I run it 1,500 times with min salary off. Right. And the goal of this is to basically look at the raw simulations, right? This is saying an average projection of one simulation per lineup. In other words, we're going to take a single game simulation from every game on the slate and build an optimal lineup for that particular slate sim, right? The highest scoring lineup possible. And the reason I do this is it helps me understand the probability of success for different players on the slate, right? It's an approximation of how likely that player is to basically be the best player you could have used in that particular position in your lineup. I typically use this to compare to ownership projections to look for ownership inefficiencies, right? I want to look, is there a player that the field is going to use 30% of the time, but I think they're only showing up, or SaberSim thinks they're only showing up in the winning lineup 10% of the time, right? That would be an inefficiency. Right now, if that's the case, I would probably rather be under on that player or maybe consider fading that player completely because I'm not essentially going to get paid appropriately for the probability of that play paying off because I took a chance on a player that had a 10% chance to pay off at that spot, but they're in 30% of the lineups. Right? DFS is not about just scoring the highest number of points possible. It's about beating all the opponents in the contest. And the more lineups that roster a particular player, the less you get paid when that player succeeds. Right? So that is essentially what I am doing here. So what it looks like in practice now that's kind of like what it is. That's the theory behind it. In practice, I will tell you kind of in general what I am looking for, but there isn't always a clear cut flow chart that you can follow here, just because every slate is going to be very different. So I will typically break things up by pitcher and batters. And really what we're looking at here is the combination of these three different numbers here, right? This is the ownership projection, the percentage of lineups that we expect to roster that particular player. This number is what percentage of lineups in this build did this player show up in, right? It essentially approximates that player's chance of showing up in the winning lineup, right? Or the optimal lineup is actually more precise. And then the leverage is the difference between those two. So I look and I'm basically kind of combining, what we're seeing from these numbers and using it as a way to become opinionated about a slate, right? And here's actually a really good example right off the bat. Now, Scherzer and Michael Kopech have essentially probably the same probability of showing up at the winning lineup. Actually, even Clevenger does as well, right? All three of these guys are very close, slight edge to Scherzer, right? But the field is basically treating these different players as if Scherzer and Clevenger are far and away the best options on the slate, right? This to me stands as a situation where I am immediately looking at a guy like Kopech as a guy that I kind of am interested in. And a little less so on the Scherzer and Clevenger side of things. But if we go one step further, I'm probably even less interested in Luis Garcia and John Gray because they have a lower raw probability of being in that higher in the winning lineup and still also are similarly negatively leveraged, right? So what I will actually end up doing when I'm going through and doing my research build is I will take notes. And one thing that I might be taking notes here on the pitcher side is I kind of like Kopech, right? I'm interested in getting some exposure there. I will probably proceed with caution with Scherzer and Clevenger. And I might be thinking about a fade or being, well under the field on guys like Gray and Garcia because, at least in the case of Scherzer, for example, I'm getting the best overall pitching play on the board, right? Even though I'm paying a little bit of inefficient ownership, he's still clearly the best overall. Well, he's still by 3.5 percentage points, the best pitcher on the board. Whereas in the case of, John Gray, he's not even one of the top overall plays here, and he's getting that inefficient ownership, right? I can very easily just get, Heaney or Logan Webb or something like that at a better ownership with a still equal probability of success, right? That's kind of the spirit of what's going on here. And I'll do the same thing on the hitters, right? Again, this number is important. This number helps characterize what we're kind of looking at here, right? Like, it will also help to show you why stacks in general are a little bit more fadeable than pitchers, right? This is an interesting slate where, things are kind of spread out, but you will often see, you can see slates sometimes where, there's a very chalky pitcher and a very chalky stack. A good example last week was the Ohtani plus Coors Field slate, right? And if you actually looked at that, if you ran the research build, you'd see something like, Ohtani was going to be 65% owned, but he was optimal 45% of the time. Whereas the Dodgers were like 35% owned, but they were only optimal like 15 to 20% of the time, right? So you can kind of see, and I'll just take some notes and get an idea of what I'm kind of looking at here. So a couple things to note here as you're getting familiar with doing this, right? A few things. First of all, one, this is not, I always want to say this every time. This is by no means a required part of the SaberSim process. So if you're watching along, you've never seen me do this before, and you're like, wait, I haven't been doing that. Am I messing something up? No, absolutely not, right? This is just another tool in your toolbox that you can use to become opinionated about a slate. I think the research build is very useful for people that, one, want to play kind of an ownership game theory angle, right? That's part of what I find fun about DFS. That's part of what I think I'm good at DFS. So that's what I like to do. And two, for people that maybe just aren't already otherwise opinionated about the slate, right? If you have a process that is working for you to figure out what players you think are over or under owned, or that you want to target or fade or anything like that, right? You don't necessarily need to just start introducing this, but we get questions all the time on office hours and through support channels and things like that are from people that say, hey, I get the SaberSim process. I get what I'm supposed to be doing, but I don't know how to know when to do that at all, right? This is a good way of basically becoming opinionated about a slate yourself. So let's jump to the next question here. And this question came in through support, and it's still about research builds, but I think it's a good kind of next step to jump to here. And this question This email was a little bit longer, but I think it's kind of summarized here as basically, okay, so summarize, how can I use research builds to determine if I should be over or underweight on certain teams? But I know what was in the actual email was very specifically about like, what if what I learned from my research build disagrees with what I'm actually getting in my lineup? So let's look at this real quick, just quickly on the hitter side, and see if we can determine any things we want to be careful with on the hitters. So just off the bat here, it looks like we think Detroit is going to be chalkier than they deserve. That's kind of the big team that's jumping out to me here. So maybe we're going to fade some Detroit stacks. Cleveland and New York kind of jump out a little bit here as well. So just real quickly, maybe we just say that we're going to be careful with New York, Cleveland, and Detroit stacks, right? Okay, so now let's talk about here, what if your actual build disagrees with what you were getting in the research build, right? So we'll run a build here. And while this is building, I think, one thing to be just aware of right off the bat is that the lower your ownership fade slider, and also to a lesser extent, the lower your sim precision slider, the less you're going to see, like the more you're going to see SaberSim just lean into the best projected plays, the less you are going to see it make ownership-based decisions. And that's a good thing, right? But, for example, if your research build says that, Scherzer's overowned, if you run that build at like no ownership fade and a low sim precision slider, well, he's projected so well that he's just going to show up anyway, right? So I think in terms of why does my actual build I'm running on default settings disagree with what I'm seeing in the research build, that's probably the most common answer here, right? Where, the ownership fade isn't actually high enough to necessarily mean that that's an actual good fade, right? Like you're not a research build is looking at optimals, right? How often does a player show up in the optimal lineup compared to their ownership? But in reality, you don't typically need the nuts optimal to take down a contest. And the smaller your contest gets, the less and less you need to even get close to the nuts optimal, which means in some ways, some of the research build assumptions kind of come down, right? Or they get a little bit worse. So I think that's an important thing to recognize. But, we can come over here and look at this and even right off the bat, right? Like let's look at our pitchers. This is a great example, right? So we're showing up as over the field here. Whoops. That actually had an impact. Typically that doesn't. Let's do this instead. We're actually showing up as over the field on Max Scherzer, even though our research build said we want to be under the field. Like why is that? And what should we do? Well, first of all, the other thing to remember too, is that at the end of the day, a research build really helps you look at individual players, but you play lineups into your contest. You don't play individual players. So there are ways to play Scherzer here, even though he is an overowned, in theory, component of a lineup. There are probably ways to play Scherzer in lineups that are net still well balanced, right? And like here's a good example right off the bat. So we get the Scherzer and we actually get Clevenger in this lineup. We get the Yankees 3 stack, which was one of the stacks we looked at and said we want to be kind of cautious with. But we get probably a very low owned Mariner stack on the other side of that, right? Like this lineup is balanced enough considering the complete construction of the lineup that we can still use Scherzer, right? And when we run the research build, we maybe are taking stands on certain players and deciding who we want to be over and under on, but it's not as if we're just eliminating every player with a negative leverage in the research build right off the bat, right? There are ways to use players that are theoretically on their own overowned in a lineup that's still good. And that SaberSim will recognize that and do that for you. The other thing to remember here is that, ultimately your pool of lineups that are built here is probably more diverse than your top 20 would ever indicate, right? Your top 20 sorted by SaberScore is going to be basically, if you say, I don't want to adjust anything else, I just want to take the default that I'm getting here. SaberScore is saying, well, then this is your best 20 considering correlation and ownership and upside of your pool of 500. But if we look here, right, 70% Max Scherzer, we're actually a little bit more even with the field in the full pool of lineups, right? So I always recommend looking at things and saying, I lost my train of thought there. I always recommend making all the adjustments that you would like to your pool and treating your pool as a set of completely viable lineups, and then letting SaberScore help decide what 20 or 150 or 3 to take with you when you're all done. So for me, I prioritize my research build a little bit over what I'm getting from my test build if I've already kind of decided how I want to attack a particular play. But you can use them in conjunction with one another, right? Like from the research build, I just took a note and said, I'm going to approach with caution with Scherzer and Clevenger. And in the test build, based on the contest settings that are optimized for this kind of contest, it's saying, maybe you want to be over the field on these guys, right? Or it's okay to be over the field on these guys. So maybe I kind of meet in the middle there and I say, I'm going to be even with Scherzer and Clevenger, right? Because I still think that ownership is just a little bit inefficient, even for a contest of this size, right? And you can see that's kind of pushing me naturally in the direction that I wanted to go. I'm getting to some Kopesh here now. I'm well over the field on Kopesh. I'm still got a few lineups with these guys in them here. I had actually identified John Gray here as a fade, just based on his ownership, right? And I can kind of keep going like that, right? So I guess to sum up here, I would say, a research build, there's two things. There's two reasons why your research build might disagree with your test build. One is because your research build is working from optimals, right? And saying what is the probability of this player being in the optimal lineup? But for a lot of different contest sizes, you don't need the true nuts optimal to take it down, right? So there can be a discrepancy there. And two, you can still play underowned. You can still play overowned players or stacks or whatever in good lineups. And if there's a wide variety of different low-owned stacks, like appears to be tonight, then there's a wide variety of different lineups that you can make that are combinations of certain pitchers that might have appeared overowned. So ultimately, I would use your research build as a data point, use your test build as a data point, and then kind of combine that with your particular stance on the slate and your risk tolerance and figure out where you want to be on some of these guys is how I would look at it. So Glenn says ownership is justified, then I would assume, and relative to other players is still the best player to use. Maybe I'm a little lost here, Glenn, on what you're saying here. I think that like this is also kind of like a fine conclusion to necessarily take. Like I think you could also come at it from this angle and say, hey, like, SaberSim's telling me that for this size contest that the ownership isn't a big deal on some of these players. And going that route, that's fine. I typically just lean a little bit more on kind of making the research build a more prominent part of my process and trusting it here. So, but let me know if I'm misunderstanding that. There might be kind of a question that I'm not getting there as well. So, okay. Let's keep it going here. We're going to back up a fair bit and just start getting caught up from all the questions that came in beginning basically Friday afternoon when I hopped off of the last stream. This one was from Toasted Taters here about NFL stacking and defenses here. And he said, last year you'd mentioned for NFL QB plus stack defense could be included in that plus stack. Has SaberSim updated for this season to not include the defense for the said stack? If we see a QB plus stack, that would assume it's just incorporating offensive players. I actually don't even remember saying that. I don't ever remember that being true, but I'm like almost positive it's not true anymore. I would be pretty surprised to see that. And maybe it did work that way for a period of time, but I don't ever remember that being something I corrected against. So I feel like it wasn't a thing. Either way, if we say like QB +2, for example, that's not saying QB plus same team defense plus a wide receiver. I think that's pretty safe. I'll check that later today. But I would assume that is not the case. A QB plus X whatever is always going to imply that it's a pass catcher on the same team. So a player that's actually positively correlated. So and then Andrew had asked a question about top 1% equity versus in diversifiers and elevators. He said top 1% equity makes sense for diversifier contests, but I question its viability in looking at elevator contests. Thoughts on expanding this to 2 to 5% in elevator contests? I actually would take the opposite approach. I think top 1% equity makes sense for a certain size of contest, right? Like for example, in a 1,000 man contest, you finish in the top 1%, you're top 10, right? That feels good. That's kind of what you're shooting for. But as the contest gets bigger, top 1% is less of a prize. And in fact, like sometimes isn't even that big of a payout, right? So I would actually say for me, I start thinking, when we start talking about larger field contests, your diversifiers, your 20 max, your 150 maxes, I think you start seeing the value of looking at things like top 0.1% equity and top 0.5% equity. At the end of the day, like top 2 to 5%, you're kind of talking about a bigger, I don't know, you're starting to talk about a bigger window of finishing percentiles that aren't necessarily the way that you choose to build your lineups, right? That's kind of the whole point of this, is like you are optimizing for a top probably 1% at a minimum outcome if you are building lineups effectively. So measuring your success rate at getting those lineups is the goal here, right? Like I don't even think I don't necessarily want a 90. I'm not shooting for a 95th percentile outcome. It's like a 99th percentile outcome at a lineup level is the way I'm thinking about it. So I think you're kind of on the right track, but I would just basically flip that. Instead of looking at top 5% for elevators, I'd probably look at like top 0.5% or top 0.1% for diversifiers. And then, okay, it looks like, okay, actually here, let's get to this question real quickly here. This was from In It to Bink It about removing players with just a single lineup in your contests. He said, is there a way to get a more concentrated player pool in golf without having to remove tons of players from the pool, wanting to avoid having lots of players in one lineup only? So I would say I think you're going to have to remove players from the pool. I don't think you necessarily have to do it all out in front of your lineup build, right? But I do think you are going to have to do it. We don't have Sims up for this week yet. Let's see. Back up here. I mean, I think at some level it is going to require a little bit of manual work here. But what I would probably do, and again, I don't know exactly what the rest of your process looks like, but I would probably build your lineups and then just look at your exposures and then just X out any players that you're only getting in a single lineup, right? I think the one other way you could do this is if you have a defined player pool, if you know what players you want in your lineups already, and you know that you want them in at least 2 lineups, right? Or at least 2 lineups every single time, you could set them as a minimum exposure in upfront, right? So let me show you both of these. So option 1 basically would be, going in here and basically just individually eliminating every player that you're only getting in a single lineup, right? Would take a little bit of time. It's going to take more time the more lineups you're playing here, but you should be able to get this done okay. The other option here would be, and basically if you're going to do it this way, you need to have a defined player pool. You basically need to say, hey, these are the guys I'm playing and I want exposure to everybody, right? But if you limit your player pool and choose what players you want, you could go in here. And in the case of if it was 20 lineups, right? Getting a player in at least 2 lineups for every single player is a minimum exposure of 10%. So you could go in and set a minimum exposure to every single player of 10%, right? Of your player pool. And I think those are probably the 2 easiest options to work with. I think I probably lean a little bit more towards setting that up front, just because I think you're gonna run out of that pool really quickly doing it the other way. So that is probably what I would recommend doing there. Okay. Let's keep it going here. Let me get caught up on this Slack here. There was a question. There was a question here about basically like lowest entrance for the profit plan. It looks like Average Tuesday and Shady Advice went back and forth a fair bit in office hours here about the contest size. When we were doing our DFS profit plan analysis, we didn't have like a hard minimum number of total entrants that I'm aware of. I do think our analysis does start to break down a little bit when you start talking about contests that are 500 or so people and lineups are smaller, especially on the elevator side, right? Like I think there was an example in Slack given of a 130 person single entry, which doesn't really function in the same way that other elevators do, where they're like these big ROI booster type contests, right? That you're starting to talk about a pretty small field there. So I do think, we're kind of roughly thinking about GPPs of 500 lineups or bigger. That doesn't mean those need to be the only lineups in your portfolio, but that's kind of the way that the analysis was done. That's kind of the contest that we were looking at there. I mean, I think at a practical level on DraftKings, there's more contests out there. So this is a little bit less so the case, but especially on FanDuel and for smaller sports, right? Like the DFS profit plan is really only going to work up to is really only going to work up to a certain amount of bankroll investment. And if you are playing at a very high volume, right? If you get to, I would say, anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 a night, you basically at that point just have to start playing at least some portion into the flagship GPP. And around that point, strictly following the DFS profit plan does start to break down a little bit, because you will run out of elevator contests, and the flagship GPP is so top heavy anyway that it kind of functions as like the whole point of diversifier contests is that they're supposed to lower your variance, but the flagship GPP is a very high variance contest. So around that point, I think there is a bit of a breakdown of the plan. I think it works very well up until that point. And I think at like smaller, medium-sized bankroll investments, I guess it works pretty well, but there is a little bit of a breakdown above and beyond that point. So, but I would say, kind of functionally speaking, I think we're talking basically about mostly contests that are about 500 lineups or more for the profit plan stuff. So Josh said 82 degrees with 10 mile per hour winds to center in Chicago. I don't like Kopesh. I haven't even looked at the weather at all today. The one thing is, with weather, that is factored into the simulations, and it will be more accurately factored into the sims as the day goes along, right? So, a lot of times my particular approach is to, like, when I'm thinking about a research build, I'm really kind of doing it with the assumption that this number is that the optimal rate is accurate, right? That the sims are accurate and the ownership projection is accurate. And I'm basically saying, that I guess essentially that the ownership discount accounts for that and some is essentially what would be implied by the research build. But yeah, no, that's fair as well. So, and he hasn't looked very good recently, but I think that's contributing to why you might be getting him at 12% owned against a team that strikes out like crazy and isn't the best overall offense anyway. It will depend a little bit on what this lineup looks like too. I know Bobby Witt's hurt. So I think there is a version of the Kansas City lineup that can come out today that is like really, really weak. So we'll see. We'll see what that looks like. But that could also then make Kopesh more chalky. So it is all related. Anyway, okay. A question from Gus here. And he said, can we set team min and max exposures before a build? So at the moment, you can't really. You can in kind of a roundabout way here. We are planning on building basically kind of a better rules dashboard for being able to do this kind of stuff ahead of time. You can set stacking rules. So you can say like at least 5 players from all of these different teams, right? And go through and pick your favorite teams here. But there's no way to set exposures to those individual teams before the build. One thing you can do here, and this is kind of a weird thing, but it works. So if you come over here and you go into an actual build that you've already run and then set your stack exposures, right? So maybe you say, I want 40% Seattle. I want 30% Dodgers or something like that, right? You can send these exposures back to the home screen, right? Using this button, send projections and or exposures to the projections page, right? And if we actually send our exposures back, it will say basically, it will give you a warning to let you know that you're doing this, but it's saying you're also sending your exposures to team, game, and stack exposures and things like that back to the home screen. And that will work. So for example, you could go into a build, set those exposures here, send them to the home screen and run a new build. And then those exposures will apply on that next build. Good thing to note here. But at the moment, there's not really a way to just, set that straight up ahead of time. That's something that we're building right now, actually. So, okay, cool. Question from Tim here. And he said, question, you don't have to spend much time on at all. Simple yes or no is cool. First MLB trade deadline for me playing MLB DFS. Do you stay away from potential players who could be traded and benched during the game Monday night because they have been traded? Thank you. Simple yes or no answer. I don't even know if I can manage that. I would say no. I have to give at least a little bit of context here. Typically, I think it's, I would say it's probably more of a slate here tonight where paying attention, right, to the news is important and potentially late swapping is important. I don't think it is a slate where I am going to just scratch players that I think are have the potential to be traded. I don't know, but I think it's something important to watch, right? The nice thing about baseball too is that we do get those confirmed starting lineups pretty early, like for Washington, right? I don't know. I mean, yeah, there's the risk that you play Soto. I don't know how much Soto anybody's getting to tonight anyway with Scherzer on the other side, but there's the risk that you play Soto and then he gets traded here. But we'll have the lineup out hours before. If he's in the lineup, I'll probably just take that on pretty good faith that he's going to be playing and assume that he's playing. And if he gets scratched minutes before lock somehow, then I'll try to just react quickly. But I think it's probably going to help you, or I think it's going to hurt you more than help you, just Xing out players that you think have a chance to be traded. Yeah, that's my take. So I did not get that down to just a simple one word answer here. But hopefully that was helpful for you anyway. Inita Binkit had also asked about soccer support. He said, what soccer support will be available this year with EPL starting next week and World Cup later on in the year? Unfortunately, probably the same as it has been for some time, which is basically just having the slates up in our app, but no simulations, right? It will require you to upload your own projections and use SaberSim more like a traditional optimizer in that case. It is on the roadmap to support soccer down the road. It is at least in our kind of initial spec for building out a soccer sim, I think it's a tougher sport to simulate. Just that it is kind of a continuous sport where it's difficult to kind of like, in a very simple sense, this is very, very basic, but in a simple sense, the more discrete of a play that you can define, like and say that is a unit of the game, right? That's a unit of time in the game. And the more frequent those happen, the easier the sport can be to simulate, right? Baseball is really easy because you can do it on a per pitch level if you want. We do it on an at-bat level. Football has very clear plays. Basketball even has very clear plays where like a play ends essentially as a possession, is the way we define a play. Sports that are more continuous and have less frequent events are harder to simulate at a very basic level, right? So at least that is the way it has been explained to me when I've done some of these streams with the models team. So all that to say, it is on the roadmap. It's a trickier sport to do. And I don't think we're going to have soccer simulations for this year, probably. We are on the model side, very, very, very focused on football. So anyway. Okay, question from Jeremy here about the profit plan as well. I should take this opportunity to talk about what the profit plan is. For those that are not sure what we are talking about here, the profit plan is basically our new and improved contest selection and bankroll management framework. So it's up on our YouTube channel here, front and center. Start winning more with our DFS profit plan. We basically built out a full contest selection framework here. A full contest simulation system framework on our end to prove this, I guess. I don't know if prove is maybe a strong word, but to defend this. And we feel very confident about this being the optimal way to select your contest. So that came out about a month ago. I know, we had some contest selection recommendations beforehand, but this is one that we feel very, very strongly about. So definitely check that out if you haven't seen that already, especially leading up here to football. Anyway, Jeremy's question said, is there a minimum amount that's needed to follow the profit plan? Could you do it with $5? I think there is a minimum amount that you need. I would say you probably, we're getting pretty low here, but I would say you probably want $6 to be able to play every single night, which would allow you to play the quarter jukebox and then throw in a single entry into like the daily dollar or the $1 single entry contest. On FanDuel, you can actually get a lot more lineups in play for a lot less money since they have a 5-cent 150 max. So I think that might be a better option if you have a smaller bankroll. I think if you're playing with $6, right, that should still only be 5% or so of your actual bankroll per slate. So you probably still need a bankroll of, $100 to $150 to start with. I think that's probably kind of the minimum. So yes, you could probably do it with around $5 per slate. I don't think if you have a $5 bankroll period, that DFS is the best use of that money. But if you have a $100 to $200 bankroll, I think it works. Playing $5 to $10 a night. You should be able to start with the quarter jukebox and the $1 and $2 single entry contests and kind of start grinding up from there. So, but. Very quick question here. Josh said 3 days away from the first NFL game. And then Patrick said, will you have the roster up for preseason? We will not. We might. Actually, I think it's possible we have the preseason slates up. I don't want to make any promises there. I would basically just assume that we will not be supporting preseason. Maybe as we go along here, we might have the slates up with no sims. We definitely don't have NFL preseason sims. But we will be ready for September 8th for sure. So Eric said $5 doubles for you, double ups. I actually would probably still recommend, even at that bankroll, I would probably still focus on I would play the profit plan contests, which are going to be GPPs. I think it's a common misconception that cash is a bankroll builder, especially in the modern 2022 landscape of DFS. It's just too sharp. So, okay. Nipsey had said, let's see. Hey, Jordan, if I change, for example, the default exposure setting from 100 to 30%, how is this, if any, affecting the default setting for the sim precision slider during the build? It doesn't directly affect it. So if you change this max exposure to 30%, first of all, what this is actually doing, this is capping really two things. It's capping your exposure to any player to 30% in your set of lineups, right? So you won't get more than 30 in your set of 20, but also in your entire pool. So you won't have more than 30% of any player in your entire pool of lineups. It doesn't directly impact the sim precision slider. Like, it doesn't actually otherwise change the sim precision slider. The projections that you're getting for different players are still set to a random set of projections from, well, not necessarily. That's not a good way of saying it. The projections are still set to, in this case, what they scored in a random sample of 18 simulations per game, right? So that still happens. Just now, when we're actually building the lineups, if a player is already present in more than 30% of the lineups in your pool, he cannot be used in that next lineup, right? As we're actually building these through. So it doesn't impact the sim precision slider directly in terms of the way that the sims are selected, but you will end up with, you're basically kind of like hard coding or brute forcing probably a more diverse pool than you otherwise would have gotten. So that is kind of how it works there. Okay. Question from Jimmy here. And then we're getting close to the end of the questions in Slack here. We'll hop over to YouTube chat here shortly. He said, if you play 20 in the $1 and 20 in the 25 cent, would you generate a pool of 40 lineups and then adjust exposures and then fill entries by unique random, as unique rank may be too complicated, concentrated thoughts? I agree with that. So I do typically use unique random. And then Jimmy said, also, if you see teams not in the 40 pool that you want to play, focusing on 5 stacks, do you just add a min exposure to them? I feel like the min and max exposures get all over the place for me, and then I get the exposures error. Could you please demo it out? Yeah, sure. I mean, so we have this 20 lineup build here. Let's just borrow this one. We recently added something here that I think is going to be really helpful for this. And that is seeing your pool exposure on the screen. So, I mean, I guess I should say a couple things first here. So first of all, I am not like very opinionated on how a particular team gets stacked for me. So for what it is worth, I don't spend a lot of time in this 5 stacks or 4 stacks or 3 stacks, right? I actually typically handle things more on an individual player level and let the stacks kind of work themselves out. But assuming I'm working in the stacks here, I will probably end up more here. And this new stack pool exposure, I think, can be very useful, right? And this is basically going to tell you how many lineups are in your pool that have that particular stack in it at all. And this can kind of give you a key, like right off the bat, am I going to be able to get this to work just using these exposures, right? If you came in here and you said, okay, ready to start working on my exposures, I'm going to make sure that I'm really over the field on San Francisco and San Diego and Washington, right? Like, you're going to get this message pretty fast, right? And we know this. Oh, actually, is it working? The message didn't pop up at all. That's kind of weird. Let's start with a fresh build here. I wonder if I messed this one up just messing around with it earlier here. Let's actually start fresh with a new one so we can get the message to pop up here. While this is building, though, I'll kind of like mention what I was talking about before. That stack pool exposure now will basically just show you what's in your pool, right? It basically pulls back the curtain on the pool. And you can kind of tell pretty quickly, like, am I going to be able to do what I want to in this build by default? If you are seeing the message that, hey, we can't meet your exposures, it is in general a sign that you probably need to go back and do another build. I think there's a couple things you could do in that particular situation. So let me recreate the message here this time, and then we'll talk about it. So, but let's let this build here. Okay. So, and then this time we're actually doing 40, right? Just like the question actually asks. So we're going over to our 40, right? And again, I mean, you can, so just to be clear, oh, I realize you guys probably can't actually see what I'm referring to here. So let me make this like more clear what I'm actually looking at here, right? Oh, hang on. Okay. So I'm looking, oh, that's annoying. Okay. Down here, I'm looking down here, right? So you can see, like, we only have 18 lineups with Colorado stacks in the pool of 500. We only have 17 lineups in the pool of 500 that have Washington stacks. We only have 22 that have Minnesota stacks, right? So, like, yeah, if you want 50% Minnesota stacks, you can get there, right? But you're barely going to get there. You're basically going to use almost every Minnesota stack that you have in the pool. And if you start going further and saying, well, I also want to get like a ton of leverage on Scherzer, you're going to run out, right? You're going to get this message. We can't meet your exposures. And we could see that happening based on looking at the stack pool exposure. So what should you do in this situation? So basically, you need to take some of what you are putting here in the post-build process and send it back to the pre-build process. So I think you can just send your exposures back, right? And basically say, hey, I know I want 50% Minnesota stacks, and I know I want 50% Washington stacks, and send them back to the home screen, right? And that's going to take you back here. And just like I mentioned before, you won't actually be able to see those stacking exposures at the moment. I know that's weird, but they are there. Another thing I would just recommend doing in that particular case is just bumping up the team total on these teams that you wanted to get more of, right? If you think these teams are better plays than SaberSim does, you should tell us that, because what that's also going to do is that's going to then correctly kind of rebalance your exposure to like players like Scherzer and whoever's on the other side of the Twins game and things like that, right? So now if we come back here, and we build another build. Hang on. Oh, I think my browser crashed. There we go. Okay. Now if we come back and build another build, now SaberSim knows that beforehand, right? Before when we ran this, SaberSim didn't know that we wanted those exposures, right? It wasn't what we were getting to organically. So we were getting jammed up, right? We were not getting the exposures we wanted. Now we've bumped up the team totals on those two particular teams, and we've set that minimum. We've sent that minimum exposure back to the home screen, and we'll get a pool of lineups that looks a lot more like what we're trying to do. So we'll let this build here for a second just to close the loop. Jimmy, let me know if that helps. That should be able to do what you are trying to do here. So, and the one thing, since I know you had mentioned it here, if you are editing the individual stack types, right? 2 stacks, 3 stacks, 4 stacks, 5 stacks, all of that, right? Those are kind of more criteria that need to be met. So it's more likely that you're going to run into errors more quickly, right? Like if you're saying, using the example before, if instead of saying 50% Minnesota stacks period, I said 50% 5 stacks, right? I'm going to meet an issue there where I have to send exposures back to the home screen earlier. One other thing to mention here is that just increasing your pool size will probably help you a bunch. Instead of building 500 lineups, building 1,500 lineups, if you're not already, will just give you a much more diversified pool that you should be able to massage to get to where you want it to be a little easier. But let's see here as this build is wrapping up, make sure that we're getting everything the way we like it here. So you can see we have our new projections that have been bumped up. You can also see now getting very little Scherzer, right? Just a 12% or so. And on our teams here, we have 50% Minnesota, 50% Washington. So, and then Ed actually asks a well-timed question here as well. And said, if I send the team stack exposures back to the home screen, how do I reset it back to the defaults if I want to later? You should still have this reset option up here, which will apply to everything. So you can still come back over here and reset everything. And that will truly reset all. Let's make sure of that before I tell you the wrong information here. Let's just do a very quick one and make sure. But I believe that reset still applies across the board. So that should reset even those hidden team stack exposures. If it doesn't, what you can instead do is reset your exposures within a given build and then send those home. So I know this is all very strange at the moment. Feels kind of awkward to do this. We know that. We are building out that rules dashboard to make this just something that you can set up front. It was an idea. The sending exposures back to the home screen was a really good app idea, I think, that we had. And then we realized that, the current version of the home screen or the projection screen didn't really have the infrastructure set up to put those anywhere, right? There's nowhere on the front end to actually put that information. So that's why we're building that. But for now, all the functionality works. It's just a little bit kind of awkward to get it there. So let's see here. Did it do what we thought it would do? It looks like it. Yes. So yes, to be totally clear, the reset button that shows up here will reset your exposures, even if they are the hidden team stack exposures there. So, and then Jimmy says that helps. I was trying to adjust specifically under the 5 stacks tab as I primarily play 5-3. Yeah, and that should still work. You should be able to still do that, doing the exact thing I just walked through. You will probably see the message saying that we can't meet your exposures more quickly, just since 5 stacks is more specific than any stack, basically. So, but all right. Okay, cool. Let's keep it going here. Let me hop over to YouTube chat here. Okay, Mike had said with the single entry series going on both DraftKings and FanDuel, do you set DraftKings to at least 4 or do 5? FanDuel, you like a 4-4, 4-3. I like to play for smaller fields like that. I'm typically going to play more correlated lineups than I would in larger field stuff. So yeah, typically, again, these are just rules of thumb. I would probably actually build out the lineups in the app and kind of see how things are looking. Every slate is a little different, but probably a safe bet that if I was building for just a single entry on FanDuel, I'd probably be targeting like a 4-4, 4-3 kind of construction. On DraftKings, I actually, I'm not necessarily just forcing a pure 5 stack, but I am going to basically say I want max 1 uncorrelated player. So I would probably still be willing to play a 4-3 on DraftKings, or a 4-4, or a 5-2, or a 5-3. That's kind of my like, that's kind of like my set of different stack types that I like to play when I want to get really correlated on DraftKings. So, but yes, I mean, the reasoning for that, right? It's a smaller field contest, right? Less entrants than large field multi-entry stuff. Everybody's got only one bullet. You need to get less right to win it than you do in a larger field contest. So instead of trying to figure out every single player, right, I'm going to correlate heavily and hope that when I get the right 2 teams in there with maybe that one-off, I don't need to get as much right as I would need to get in a 50,000 person contest where maybe you start thinking about 4-2-1-1 stacks and maybe I don't know. I guess that's probably a good example. 4-2-1-1 stacks. I still stack quite a bit in the larger field stuff, but anyway, yes. So, let's see. Brad says, I do have a minor question, not specific to anything, but has SaberSim changed or made adjustments on anything, or has my luck just drew to my favor recently? My lines the last few days have been more competitive and more consistent, so I was just wondering if something changed or if I've gotten lucky the last couple of days. Well, a lot has changed. Depending on when you are asking this kind of from. But probably if you're just running kind of hot the last couple of days, it's probably more about that you have just been running a little hot. I mean, the one thing that immediately jumps to my mind of like, this will give you better lineups with no additional work is the upside correlation change we made recently. So instead of calculating correlation on averages, as of a couple months ago, 6 weeks ago, maybe, we changed that. So now we measure and calculate correlation in the upside outcomes, right? Like basically we don't really care if 2 players are correlated when they have a 40th percentile outcome, right? We want to see what the impact of a player having a 99th percentile outcome is on other players in that game. That is now how correlation works. If you're actually, I forgot we had a video up on this. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's a video on our YouTube channel here as well, how to build better DFS stacks with upside correlation. That's probably the first thing that jumps to my mind of like, that is a change we made to the models that will just instantly improve the quality of your lineups. Actually, I mean, another one, now I'm kind of thinking about this here. Another one is we did change our pitch count model, or a pitcher leash model here in the past week or so. I had Eric on who worked on this project. He's one of our data scientists. I had him on last week talking about basically his research and how he made these changes here. Really interesting video that will also have improved the quality of your lineups with basically no real additional work on your end. So there's always improvements. And that's only even on the model side and the lineup builder side. That doesn't even account for anything that we've done just on the app, which there have been some changes on the app as well. But yeah, so. All right. Let's see. Ryan says, I'm probably just going to start playing every showdown on FanDuel and DraftKings instead of trying to battle it out on the main slate for the big 3 sports. Yahoo is the only site where the main slate is enjoyable. Nothing wrong with that. I do think there is a value in targeting the contests and sport and game types that you're more interested in or you have a bigger edge in. So I got no problem with that if that's where you've been successful. So DG said MMA optimal wasn't reached in the big GBP, but it was in the quarter jukebox with 12K less entries. One dude had the lineup 3 times. All these games are beatable. May the variance be with you. Yes, you cannot underrate the value of variance or the impact of variance on these things. I know there was a bit of an interesting conversation on Twitter yesterday Ship my money, Adam, was duped in the like 10-person field of the MMA live final round 3 or whatever it was. And I know DFS Daily Newsletter kind of called him out for that. And, Adam's response was basically like, I can't control that level of randomness. That like, I think he said he picked the 25th highest optimal and happened to get duped in a game with 9 other entrants in it. So yes, that kind of stuff can happen. Honestly, part of the reason that we recommend people follow the DFS Profit Plan is that it diversifies you into different contests. Like you get the opportunity to play different contests, so you don't end up in a situation where your equity in a given slate is so dependent on the lineups in that exact contest you're playing, right? Like if you spread out and get action in different contests, you kind of lower the value that one like massive, just total stone optimal that somebody like luck boxes into in one of your contests has on your potential winnings that night, right? So, but yes. So anyway, Craig said, I noticed that in the research build, you changed the min salary to 0, but when you ran a regular build, you did not change it to 0. Do we need to change it to 0 for research builds or leave it alone? It's not going to have a huge impact either way. It's kind of like a technicality. But since we are trying to basically build single slate simulation optimals with a research build, I don't want to like block. Technically having a min salary on is going to slightly overfavor higher salary players, just a slight bit. So I would not worry about it. But I think if you're being a research build perfectionist like I am, I think it is technically correct to turn min salary to 0 so that you don't want to force the builder to build you a lineup that wasn't actually the optimal for that slate sim because it has to build a lineup at 48,000 salary. That's basically the reason why I do that. So, and then Eric had said, hey, question, what does the 10-0-0 build do? Is that optimal? Just wondering. Thanks. I assume you're talking about the 0-0-10 and not the 10-0-0. I spent most of the first 20 or so minutes on the show here today talking about those builds. So I would just rewind. If you go back basically to the very beginning, there's a pretty good discussion on research builds. I think this is honestly something that I will probably just end up creating a video for because I know there's a lot of questions about it. I think it'd be helpful to have like a very basics of a research build video out there that we can send people to, because I know there's a lot of excitement, a lot of discussion about research builds. So, and then Eric said, "Miss the days when SaberSim was a nice little secret." I assure you, ultimately, still a little fish in a big pond when it comes down to like how much the SaberSim community represents. DFS, I think even if you were just kind of in the DFS social media internet space overall, you're actually still in a pretty big bubble. Like I'm not even referring to just like the SaberSim bubble, which is like a very small bubble of people, but actually just the overall, like you pay for a lineup optimizer or something like that, right? Like, or some kind of DFS content, you're actually probably in a smaller subset of people than you might think. Let's see here. Patrick said Najee Harris stood out. Who else do you see from a price point? I will say, I assume you're talking about the DraftKings salaries. Everybody looks kind of cheap, partially to me. I think they make those salaries very soft, very easy to build whatever kind of lineups you want just for week one, just for people that are new to DFS, checking it out for the first time. It's not the most enjoyable experience when you're trying to just throw a couple lineups in for fun on your phone for the first time and you keep getting blocked by salary, right? Like they kind of want people to get lineups in easily. So I think for something like week one, salaries just are kind of soft. Najee Harris definitely stood out to me. I completely agree. 6.4. He's like the same price as Josh Jacobs. That seemed very low to me. Michael Pittman, I think is 5.2, seemed kind of low to me. I think they are playing the Falcons or something like that as well, right? I might be wrong about that. I think Matt Ryan's getting the revenge game narrative on the very first week. He seemed low. So did TJ Hawkinson. I think he's 4.9. I spent like maybe just 15 or 20 minutes just kind of scrolling through, and there were a couple guys there that jumped out as kind of low to me. But Johnny said, quick question about MVP or captain ownership. Will there ever be a standalone ownership number for these? Thanks. Yes, there will be soon. TM. It's been on our list for a while. It's just an annoying problem to solve. Basically, the reason why it is the way it is because FanDuel doesn't apply a different. It doesn't really matter really what the reason is, but FanDuel doesn't give a different player ID to these players rostered in different positions, right? So it makes calculating these things different because you need some kind of unique identifier for what position they're played in, but then you need to convert back to the correct identifier when you're actually talking about like what where they actually end up getting played into the lineup. It's just kind of annoying. It's just an annoying data problem. So yes, I mean, the plan is eventually to resolve that. But Eric says, quick question, does doing a build automatically refresh projections, or is a refresh generally recommended before building? Ooh. I think it's probably best practice to do a refresh before building. Yeah, I think it's probably best practice. I think I'm not positive. I think you risk building with old projections without it, and it just takes a couple seconds. So I would say yes, best practice would be to refresh before building. So Tracy said, how come when I used the sim post slate and sorted by actual score, I couldn't get the winning lineup in even 1,500 lineups, and the closest the score was off by 12 points in baseball? Does that mean Saber can't build a takedown lineup even with actual scores from the contest? Well, the reason is you're still building with the existing projections beforehand, right? 1,500 lineups, though it sounds like a lot of lineups, is just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the actual even playable lineups that you could build in a slate, right? Even if you limited and said only lineups over 48,000 salary and above a certain projection point, there are probably at least millions of different playable lineups for a given slate. For a 9-game baseball slate on DraftKings tonight, it might be billions of lineups. When you're building a 1,500 lineup pool, you are still basically slicing off a portion of those lineups at the top that we believe, based on the way that we're simulating games, to be the most profitable lineups. If you could build the highest actual scoring lineup, or basically build the nuts in a pool of 1,500 lineups every single night, you would probably be the best baseball DFS player of all time, right? That would be such an improbably accurate model and system that you would win basically every 10 days, right? Like, assuming that you're playing 150 lineups a night, you would basically like win every 10 days or more, depending on how well you were able to select out of that 1,500 for your 150, right? That's kind of a good way to think about it. Nobody wins that often, no matter what you see on Twitter. So, in fact, I think when you have the nuts in your 1,500 lineups, that actually means you were super, super close. Like, you were very close. You probably a different version of that night, right? A slightly alternate universe. You probably take it down. So, yeah. Ultimately, I think 1,500 lineups. People think 1,500 lineups is covering like all of the outcomes. I mean, I know I even imply that sometimes when I talk about research builds, but in reality, it's still a very small subset of lineups that can win, right? So, sorry, Craig. Craig says, I was asking if the min salary needs to be 0 for regular builds, not the research builds. No, unless you want to let some lower salary builds into your lineups, right? I think that, sometimes that can be nice for, especially if you're playing a lot of large field stuff, but no, you don't need to turn min salary to 0 for regular builds. It's not going to, I guess, let me say this. It's not going to hurt you to do it, right? Because you're building lineups on SaberSim from sets of simulations, right? So if you build lineups with min salary 0, you still know that those lineups are optimal, at least bucketing sims into 18 sim buckets and building optimals from there, right? So it's not going to hurt you. I think Shady Advice in Slack has a very eloquent way of talking about min salary, right? These salaries are actually these are still just a projection model, right? When DraftKings sets salaries, they're doing that essentially in a way that is the same as projecting player performance, right? If you sort by salary, you are sorting by what DraftKings projections theoretically are for these players. When you sort by my projection, right? You are sorting by SaberSim's projections for these players. So when you are building lineups and you have a min salary set here, it is basically a hedge, right? It's saying I think the best way of thinking about it is it's saying there's so many lineups you could build. We might as well avoid any lineups that have a very low min salary, because it would imply that DraftKings projection model is very off, which can be true sometimes. But that's kind of what's implied there. And we might as well play lineups that are above the min salary floor is essentially what this is here for. But by no means is it necessary. So anyway, I know that I may have managed to just confuse people more by answering that question. So if that's the case, don't feel like you need to touch this ever. It is fine where it's at. Okay. Patrick says, Ross Chastain took an illegal access road to finish second after the race. He was penalized and dropped to 27th place. Wow. There's been some NASCAR drama recently, hasn't there? I didn't watch, and I didn't play any NASCAR DFS this weekend, actually. I'm curious now. An illegal access road makes it seem like he came in off a dirt road or something like that and jumped ahead and finished second at the last second or something like that. I'm trying to imagine where an illegal access road even exists on the track. But all right. Anyway, Patrick says, I know that I noticed with the entry editor that DraftKings shows how much money you've invested in the contest, but FanDuel doesn't. Not a big deal, but I always like to sort by entry fees and see how much I've invested in overall contest. The reason for that is that it's in the CSV file for DraftKings and it's not for FanDuel. So we basically show in the entry editor the information that is in the CSV. And since that information is not in the CSV, it's not a very easy way to show that. So. Craig says, do you set it to 0? I have been experimenting with more lower salary builds this year because I think that DraftKings salaries and FanDuel salaries have been very inefficient. So I have been lowering this, especially when I'm playing larger field contests. The one thing to be aware of here, if you're going to do that, is to be careful with your ownership fade slider. Because if you decrease this or set this at 0, you basically provide almost an out to the ownership fade slider, because you basically allow all of a sudden, like if you want, hey, what's the lowest ownership build I can make? Well, a lot of times it's like a lineup that's like, maybe 42,000 salary or something like that. That might not necessarily be the best lineup that you could actually play. So I would say if you experiment with lower salary builds, to just proceed with caution with your ownership fade slider. So. Willie says, I think a lot of people using optimizers and the like are not crunching enough lineups. I hear a lot of people only making 500 to 1,500 lineups, but in reality, they should be crunching so much more. Crunch as many as possible, I always say, and then sort the best ones from there, especially in MLB where variance and possible combos winning lineups is so vast. Yeah, I think that's fair. We have had a somewhat similar thought on the SaberSim side here as well, and actually have plans to those that want it, have a new option. Basically, it's going to be a subscription add-on instead of just a add-on to the app, to build up to 5,000 lineups for those that have a process that demands it. Basically, I will say I think part of the reason that building so many lineups is so crucial for other tools out there is because you are basically starting from truly scratch, right? You sit down with Fantasy Cruncher, you are sitting down with a tool that will only build basically cash lineups left to its own devices. That is all it knows how to do, is optimize for average projection. And every component, every part of your process that you have to add there to help it deal with correlation and ownership and the real ranges of outcomes of players and lineup construction and things like that are all rules that you need to put in. And I think because of that, because of the amount of error there and the amount of compounding assumptions that you can have happen there, you are better served building a ton of lineups, a massive amount of lineups, to then select you're basically going to have more bad lineups from the start. I think if you even with a well-intentioned Fantasy Cruncher process, I think you would probably find that your 500 lineups, if you just crunched 500, would be worse than the 500 you would get on average than from SaberSim, meaning that when you finally select your 150 or 20 out of that, they are also worse. So, but we are planning on adding that in the future. So, Bobby Schmerda says, I'm confused. Please help. I would recommend, Bobby, starting here in the app. There's up here, settings, help. That's going to take you to a landing page here in our support here that will basically kind of show you. It is a quick 8-minute tutorial that I think will get you up to speed with how to use SaberSim, and then links to different tutorials and FAQs that are in our like knowledge base from here. But that is where I would recommend starting with SaberSim. So. Cool. Any other questions here for me on today's stream? We're actually a little over on time already here, but if there are any other last minute questions here, happy to answer these. It looks like, let's see. Okay, a couple other questions here coming in. Let's see. Nancy Drew guy says, what all goes into a SaberSim projection? So, well, first of all, so a projection here for SaberSim is just a way to visualize what is the real range of outcomes of an actual player, right? So when we say Scherzer's projected here for 19.99, that is just actually the arithmetic mean, right? The actual mean average of his full range of outcomes here that we have from our sims, right? So like when you're asking kind of what goes into a SaberSim projection, this really isn't the end product here for SaberSim in the same way it is for other tools out there, right? Like other tools will just kind of create the average and then do everything with the average. This is really just a helpful way of boiling down this information to a single number. And in fact, when we actually build the lineups here, right, we don't even use just the average projection, right? We randomly grab simulations here from that full set of thousands of sims of each game here, and then use what those players scored in that set of sims to build your lineups, right? So kind of important here to note right off the bat, in terms of what goes into a SaberSim projection, what goes into the SaberSim sims, we have a whole video on our YouTube channel. Basically, we do one of these for every single sport about how the actual sims work. I do an interview with the guys that actually build these sims out at the start of pretty much every major sports season. So this is the one for baseball. If you're interested in watching this, hearing it from Matt and Will, who actually build the MLB Sims, is a little bit more articulate than I can provide. But I will say at kind of a basic level, it's a play-by-play game simulator, right? So essentially what happens is we will, in the sim, the leadoff batter will come up at the top of the inning, right? We will have an understanding of that batter's history, right? Experience, their career in baseball, right? With a way of weighting that essentially towards more recent performance. Also an understanding of the pitcher, right? And then all the other things that ultimately end up affecting the game. So park factors, weather, the umpire, different things like that. And then as the game sims, game context starts to come into play a little bit, right? Like, so we'll essentially assess the probability of all the different outcomes in that at bat, right? So there's a strikeout, there's a walk, there's a single, double, triple, home run, or an out, basically, right? So let's say the leadoff batter walks, right? Well, now the second leadoff batter is now batting in that context of there's a guy on first, right? So now we're kind of simming that game now, adjusting for that. And we do that play by play through the entire game, and then do each of those thousands of times for every game on the slate. And then we rerun that and readjust every time news changes about the game leading up. So that's kind of how it works in a nutshell. But again, there's way, way more detail in this video. And I'd go check that out there and do that from there. So. Bobby says, when I hand build, I feel like I can leverage ownership. Why would I sim 500 lineups to get the one I could have just hand built? If you can hand build the nuts, then so be it. I would say one of the biggest advantages to people that like to hand build and just play a few lineups every night, that I think there is in using a tool like SaberSim is that, I mean, sure, maybe you can hand build a competitive lineup in a few minutes, right? Or maybe, maybe you're even really good at it and you could do 5 or 10 different lineups and kind of see how things are coming together. I don't think you can probably build 1,500 different options as quickly as you can on SaberSim, or even 500, right? And I think one of the coolest things about this here is that you'll get 500 viable lineups that are optimized for the particular contest that you are playing. And then you can go in and basically see these laid out in front of you and pick a lineup, or maybe find an angle that you weren't particularly looking at. There's all kinds of things you can do. And as of last week, you can actually edit a lineup now directly in the app. So I think that's probably the biggest advantage is that, I mean, hand building takes time, right? And especially as things are changing, as news changes throughout the day, you're going to kind of have to reevaluate at every step and rebuild lineups in your head or by hand to figure out now what do I want to do? And with a tool like SaberSim, you can, I mean, it just took, what was that? Maybe 20 seconds or so here to get 500 good ones, right off the bat. And now we can come in here, and how this is my favorite way of using SaberSim if you're just playing a few lineups, is come over here now and look at the pool, right? And going through, and we can actually even, so they're all in color, and you can start to go through and figure out I mean, these are 500 competitive lineups right out of the gate. And you could even filter here, right? Maybe you've done your research and you have figured out that based on the way that your hand builds were working out or something like that, that you want to play Scherzer and let's say just Clevenger, for example, and that that you want to play a some other stack here, right? We'll just make it simple here, and a Kansas City stack, right? Just for the hell of it. Well, now you've got 14 lineups here in your pool that you can look through. And maybe you say, well, 14 is not enough for me. I want to see more options. You could come back here to the projections tab and lock in a 5 stack of the Royals, Scherzer, and Clevenger, and build another 500 or 1,500 lineups that have all of those guys in them, right? You can come over here and do this. And then a 5 stack of the Royals. And now, again, 20, 30 seconds later, we have 500 lineups that are built the exact way now that you want them this way, right? So, I mean, even if you are building very good competitive hand-built lineups, that's great. But I doubt that you can build 500 of them that quickly and see all the different angles of opportunities of how you could construct that lineup. If you say you're playing $25 to $30 a day, would it be worth however much this product is? I think so. But that's ultimately more of your determination to make. We do have a free 7-day trial on our site. So you are welcome to give us a try for 7 days. It is the only totally free 7-day trial in the DFS optimizer market. So if you want to give us a try. Patrick says, so for Live Golf, could I just use my salary base as a projection and just upload my own ownership projections? I cannot in good faith totally endorse that. Mostly again, because I think honestly, if you were going to do a salary-based projection like that, golf is probably the best example of doing it, just because golf salaries are already pretty efficient. They're pretty good. But I can't in good faith tell you that you're going to necessarily get good lineups just doing that. I think you'd probably be better off trying to source real projections from somewhere and using those instead. But cool. All right. I'm going to let that cap off our stream here for today. I will be right back again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2:00 Eastern. Thank you, everybody that tuned in. stuck around, asked questions, participated today here. We have had some very busy streams here. We have had some very busy streams the last few days with, I think, football coming up, a lot of excitement around that. So I will see everybody here again tomorrow. Enjoy this slate here tonight. I think it'll be a pretty fun one where it doesn't seem like we're going to have too much like super mega chalk. I know Yankees, Mets, Scherzer, all a little popular there. But I don't think especially coming out of Dodgers at Coors last week, it feels like there's a little bit less of that super chalk, 35%, 40% owned hitters stuff on this slate. So looking forward to it. Good luck tonight. And I will see you all tomorrow. Take care.